what's going on in life is that it's all about energy, and it's all about the flow of energy. And that actually, to him, is much more fundamental than the things we normally think about when we think about life and we think about the origin of life, which is proteins and DNA, the molecules.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today I'm speaking with Philip Ball. Philip is a science writer and author who has degrees in both physics and chemistry. For 20 years, he was an editor at the journal Nature, and now he writes for outlets like New Scientist, The Guardian, Scientific American, New Statesman, The Atlantic, and others. He's written over a dozen books, including H2O, a biography of water, How to Grow a Human, Serving the Reich, The Struggle for the Soul of Physics under Hitler, and most recently, The Book of Minds, How to Understand Ourselves and Other Beings from Aliens to Animals. His recent story in Nautilus was a profile of the chemist Nick Lane titled The Big Thinker. Nick Lane is asking and answering the vital questions about life. Philip, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for asking me.
To start off, would you mind summarizing your background intellectually and as a writer for our viewers?
Right, sure. Many years ago, I studied as a chemist at Oxford University, and having graduated there, I went on to do a PhD in physics, in condensed matter physics at the University of Bristol. And so that was my background in physical sciences. And I went straight from completing my PhD to work at Nature. I joined Nature in 1988 when, this was a very different era in all sorts of ways. And it was certainly a very different journal. Now, today, Nature is this big publishing empire. In those days, it was just a single journal run out of a relatively small office with a very small staff. And what that meant was that we editors had to cover a lot of ground. And so it was a very steep learning curve. It could be that if my colleague was away for 1 week who handled astronomy, then I would be handling the astronomy papers or the earth sciences papers. So it was a fantastic place to learn about the breadth of science, of the sciences. And really, that's why I stayed there for so long, because it was such a great place to be working. But I wanted to write. There were opportunities to write at Nature, and I realized that it was something that I wanted to do more and more of, and that I wasn't going to be able to do that while working more than full-time, really, as an editor at this journal. So I gradually went part-time, and that part-time got smaller and smaller, and the writing got bigger and bigger, and eventually, I can never remember when it was, but it was probably around the turn of the millennium, I decided to go completely freelance and really just focus on writing. And that's what I've been doing ever since. So I feel I'm in this now very fortunate position of being able to make a living doing that while being able to follow my own curiosity and my own interests, and to spend perhaps, 2 or 3 years really digging into a particular subject that interests me and writing a book about it.
Fantastic. Yeah. And the latest subject that you've been diving into appears to be chemistry and the origins of life, with this profile of Nick Lane, once again called The Big Thinker. Would you mind giving our viewers a brief summary of that piece for if they haven't read it yet?
Yeah, well, Nick is, he's actually someone I've known for quite a while now, because he is also, like me, a science communicator, but he's very unusual in many ways, in that he's also a research scientist. And he kind of he like me, he studied for a PhD, and then he kind of came out of science and went into doing other things to do with science communication, decided to write a book, and in the process of doing that, found that he had questions that he wanted to have answered about biochemistry. That was really his subject. And in particular, what he was working on was subjects connected to oxygen and the role that oxygen plays in our body. And it began with the study of things called oxygen-free radicals, which are things that form in our body. They're a result of the fact that oxygen is this extremely reactive molecule. We take it for granted that it's we need it and it's all around us, but actually, in some ways, it's quite a toxic, corrosive molecule, and our bodies have special mechanisms for dealing with that. And they have to mop up these things called free radicals that might otherwise cause biochemical havoc in the cell. So Nick was working on this, and the more he looked into it, the more he looked at the question of oxygen and where oxygen came from, why we have so much oxygen in the on the Earth, and why it is that we ended up breathing this, quite unusual and very reactive chemical. The more he looked into that, the more he seemed to find that respiration and the way we use oxygen in our metabolism seemed to be central to so many biological processes and so many biological questions, both today and to do with the origin of life and the evolution of life. And he found that he wanted to explore these questions further. And so he got back into academia, and he got a lucky break. I mean, this is what he told me, that he was able to get a position that was kind of a blue skies research position at University College London for people who were sort of exploring a very broad question in an open-ended way. And that's exactly what Nick was doing. That, his interest in oxygen and metabolism and in the mitochondria in our cells, which is where respiration and sort of takes place, where it's basically where our cells produce their energy. That these questions led him in so many directions. And so I think it was around 2005, he started in this position at University College London, at UCL. And he's been there ever since. So he runs now actually a very big, in fact, it's the biggest the biggest lab in the department of biochemistry. And he's exploring really fundamental questions that have implications for the origin of life, for the way our cells work, for the origin of complex creatures like us, really for the origin of biomolecular complexity. All of these things Nick links back to the role that oxygen plays, and in particular the role that really the transition that happened when the earliest organisms became aerobic, started using oxygen, and started being able to rely on having these compartments in their cells called mitochondria that produce energy, which gave them suddenly a bigger resource of energy that they could use to do things like grow more into more complex organisms, and ultimately to grow into organisms like us. So asking this sort of simple question about, why oxygen has opened up for Nick a whole host of questions that are really big general questions about why life is the way it is.
So you said you've known Nick for a while. What was the impetus or the inspiration for writing this profile on him now?
Well, it's actually something that I had done before, because Nick is he's as well as researching these questions, he's writing about it, and he's a fantastic writer. So I've brought a couple of his books along, in which he's sort of laying out these ideas and where they're leading him. This one was one that particularly got a lot of interest. It's called The Vital Question, and it was really laying out this whole hypothesis for the origin of life and the very early development of life that he'd been developing. And as I say, because he's a communicator, it's not a big community here in the UK, and we kind of all know each other. So I would run into Nick here and there. We were both chemists of sorts in the early days, and so we share that interest amongst others. So yeah, I talked to him a lot. His latest book, and the one that this profile was largely about, is called Transformer, and it's really it's a further development of these ideas, but it's really looking at what is called the Krebs cycle, which is basically the central metabolic cycle of chemical reactions that underpins pretty much all living things. They all tend to use some variant of this cycle of reactions. So there's a whole kind of cycle that between different molecules, during the course of which other kinds of molecules are spun off in this metabolic process, things that we need, like amino acids and the chemical units that make up nucleic acids, RNA and DNA. but also it produces energy. And it's actually Nick said to me, in fact I met him about a year ago at a scientific event, and he was saying, I'm writing this next book I'm writing. He sort of had this rueful grin on his face. He said it's about the Krebs cycle, and he says it's one of the most dry things that biochemistry students have to learn, and everyone has to try and remember, God, what comes next in this cycle. And it really sounds like the driest of textbook stuff. And he could see that he'd set himself a very big challenge of how he was going to make this topic interesting. But to him, this is really a central element of how life works and why it is the way it is. And so he set himself that challenge. And to my mind, I think he's succeeded fantastically in conveying what it is about the Krebs cycle that opens up so many insights into the way life has evolved. So really, that's it was suggested to me that I might do this interview, and because I knew Nick and because I'm an admirer of his work and his writing, I was very glad to meet up with him. I hadn't seen him since that time, and to catch up with exactly where he was with this project and with the research that lies behind it.
So, yeah, you mentioned he views the Krebs cycle as kind of a difficult and dry subject to try and get people interested in. But I imagine you must have inherited that challenge slightly in writing about the Krebs cycle through his research. So was that a challenge for you? Was that a hard part of reporting the story, trying to get across his take and his insights into that phenomenon?
Well, I guess I had a much easier task of giving just a sort of qualitative insight into what it is about these processes that Nick is finding out about them and why he thinks these things are so central. Whereas what he's tried to do, and I mean, he told me when I spoke to him that he really wanted to lay out his reasoning to the reader, which requires a lot of patience on the part of the reader, because it means you have to look at the molecules. And that, as someone who writes about chemistry, I know how hard it is to get to make a page like this kind of appealing to a general reader. And Nick said, he really didn't know whether he'd succeeded in doing this, in drawing these pictures of the molecules. Are you just putting people off? I hope not. And I think that because he's such a lucid explainer of what's going on, I hope it's clear why he's showing us these pictures and what they're actually about and what's going on with these molecules. But yeah, I guess in my piece I wanted to give a general kind of picture of what drives the central ideas behind all of these books, which Nick put it very well, actually. I think it was in Transformer. He said that really what's going on in life is that it's all about energy, and it's all about the flow of energy. And that actually, to him, is much more fundamental than the things we normally think about when we think about life and we think about the origin of life, which is proteins and DNA, the molecules, how and the molecules that are involved in replication. So a lot of talk about the origin of life discusses it in terms of replicating molecules and how they got more and more complex and where did they come from. In Nick's view, energy came first, metabolism came first, and the genes came after. So this is how he says, he puts it. He says, the unceasing flow of energy and matter through a world in perpetual disequilibrium conjures genes into existence. So, his idea is that it was these cycles of energy flow that started life. And actually what does happen, and what happens still today, is that once you have this cycle, as I say, the components of DNA and RNA are made through this cycle. So it makes perfect sense to think that, first of all, you have to get this metabolism going somehow, and only then do you start to produce the materials that you need to create these genetic systems that can pass on genetic information between generations of these earliest organisms. So that's really the picture that he presents, and the way that he thinks it happened. And this, he's very eager to stress this isn't his idea. The way it's suggested that this happened is that it all started under the sea in volcanic structures called hydrothermal vents, which is where volcanism underneath the seabed drives very hot mineral-rich fluids up through these sort of cracks in the rock, and they precipitate other minerals out, and gradually you get building up, you get these kind of, they're really chimney-like structures on the seabed that are sort of spewing out hot gases and hot fluids, and a rich mixture of chemicals. And Nick has sort of run with the idea that was developed by others, by Mike Russell, and who's essentially a geochemist, and Bill Martin, who is a microbiologist. That these were the source. This was the source not just of energy, but actually of the kind of compartmentalization that channeled that available energy into proto-organisms that started to develop their own metabolism. So this is the view that the origin of life began not in some kind of in the surface of the seas by the creation of amino acids and nucleic acids, but deep down at these volcanic sites. Out of too dark for light to have been a factor, too dark for photosynthesis. All the energy was coming from volcanism.
Right. I vaguely have the sense that I used to believe, and I believe a lot of people still think, that the life must have happened with some interaction between the sun shining onto like some shallow, murky soup between the shore and land, and got some chemical reaction started there and outburst the rudiments of life. But no, it's probably life started deep in the ocean from energy stemming from the earth rather than the sun.
I think that there's an increasing feeling that this is a very likely scenario for how it happened. That's right. That, these vents were only discovered in the mid-1970s, and Mike Russell started to put this picture of, how this could have led to sort of proto-living organisms, forming at these vents. He started to put that picture together in the 1980s. And as you say, Brian, until then, there was a very popular view, and really it goes back to Darwin, actually, to Charles Darwin, that life began by somehow the chemicals that are needed forming in shallow lakes or warm waters at the surface, perhaps driven by sunlight. There was a view that maybe lightning in the early atmosphere would have induced chemical reactions between the components of the atmosphere, very simple molecules, maybe like methane or carbon dioxide or hydrogen, that would have combined them into the very simple organic molecules that could have then led to life. So that was the scenario that was first explored experimentally in 1953 by Harold Urey and Stanley Miller, when they did these amazing experiments of passing electrical discharges to mimic lightning through what they thought might be a sort of mixture, a chemical mixture that simulated the early atmosphere. In fact, we now think the atmosphere had a different composition. But anyway, this is what they did in 1953. And they found that this process could lead to the formation quite quickly of some simple amino acids. And so everyone thought, okay, amino acids are the components of proteins, and everyone thought, aha, this is where we get it from. We got the amino acids, they form in the surface waters, and then somehow they link up, and somehow they start doing stuff and catalyzing reactions. And it was a kind of a plausible story, but no one could very easily find a way of making it work. And I think what Nick and what Mike Russell and Bill Martin and others have really hit on is that that's because it's pretty much an equilibrium system that's occasionally jolted out of that equilibrium, whereas what you really need, because this is what life is like, is constant disequilibrium to drive processes perpetually. That's really what life needed to get started. And at vents, these hydrothermal vents, the idea is that that energy, it's warm, but in particular, what's important is that you have concentration gradients of chemicals. So you have, it's the vents are often alkaline, so there's a different concentration of hydrogen ions, near the vent than maybe further from the vent than near the vent. So you have that gradient. A gradient like that of hydrogen ions is basically what all life uses to drive its metabolic processes. It's certainly what is created by photosynthesis, and it's gradients like this are also present in our cells, because you can use a gradient like that. If you have a gradient that's separated by a membrane, so you have a high concentration of hydrogen ions on one side and a low concentration on the other, that acts a bit like a sort of a dam wall with lots of water on one side and nothing on the other, that you can use as an energy source. And that's what was possible at hydrothermal vents, and that seems to be the way that ultimately living creatures derive, or living organisms derive, their energy today.
Can you share any interesting bits from your research or reporting that didn't make it into the final draft, but maybe you had in and ended up taking out? Or
I mean, we had a long chat. I think one thing that I didn't sort of make too much of, and that I was really interested to discover, is that Nick has started getting interested. I mean, these ideas just seem to lead everywhere in biology, and he started getting interested in consciousness and sentience, and whether these ideas about metabolism and energy flows have anything to say about that. And what one thing he said to me, I don't think this is, I'm not sure if this is in the article. I asked him, because he sort of speculated at the end of Transformer about this, he asked, does a bacterium feel anything when it has this kind of electrical potential, this difference in electrical charge across its membrane, and when that changes, because the ions are allowed to pass across the membrane, does that feel like anything for a bacterium? And I thought, wow, what an interesting question. What does that mean? And Nick said, well, why wouldn't it? He said, okay, that's not an answer about what a feeling is, but what is a feeling? He said it's a field, it's an oscillation in a field, in an electric field. I mean, these changes in electrical potential are how our nerves work in our brain. That it's all about the movement of ions creating, differences in electrical charge. So he was prepared to, start thinking about where the origins of sentience, of feeling, come from, and whether they actually go right back to the earliest organisms. And, it was interesting because I've just written this book about minds and where we can find minds and what different minds might be like. I explored in that book this idea that that is certainly considered seriously these days, that perhaps in some sense every living entity has some kind of proto-feeling, that purely by virtue of being a sort of closed system that has to occasionally open itself out to its environment to let ions in or out, or other chemicals in or out, that sort of opening up to the environment, some people have suggested that might be enough in itself to create some sort of response, in a cell that is it's like they talk about it as atoms of sentience. Now, I don't know what I feel about this. I'm agnostic about it. It's very hard to know what a feeling could even be like for a bacterium. But I think they're interesting ideas to explore, and I was very interested to find that Nick had started thinking in this way too.
Yeah, you totally anticipated my next question, which was about the very thing you mentioned, that some of his ideas kind of lead in this speculative direction about the centrality of energy and how that links up with consciousness. And I mean, it sounds like what you're talking about is kind of a panpsychist perspective, where you're really just thinking that consciousness is fundamental, even at the level of particles. Perhaps, I mean, maybe it goes to bacteria. I sort of have a more commonsensical view that perhaps insects are conscious, to some minimal extent, but viruses or bacteria, maybe not.
Well, viruses are, are slightly different anyway because there's still no consensus
Yeah,
on whether we can think of them as being genuinely alive, and they don't really have they don't have a membrane in the way that bacteria do that has these kind
right.
of potential, the electrical potentials across it. But certainly, with bacteria, yeah, there is this idea. It's not quite panpsychist, which there are people who take that idea seriously now. That actually, many things, perhaps not all things, but many things can be consciousness, and consciousness can reside in all sorts of places. But this idea is often talked about as biopsychism, the idea that all living things, so from single-celled organisms, from bacteria and archaea upwards, that all of them can be attributed some degree of sentience. And to some degree, it's always going to come down to what we mean by those words, because I agree that I think there's very plausible arguments now that we should attribute sentience at least to insects. Some people have argued that something like that, some sort of feeling, might exist in plants. They don't have nerves, but they are able to communicate within themselves by electrical signals passing between cells. This is something that is quite general to cells, not just nerve cells. But yeah, when we get all the way down to yeast and then ultimately to bacteria, it's very hard to know what that means. But the way I really think about it and talk about it in my book about minds is that regardless of whether we attribute bacteria a minute amount of sentience or none at all, I think that it's actually a useful way of thinking about how they behave and how they work is with reference to cognition, which is a slightly different thing. It's not really making claims necessarily about a feeling, but if we think of it as a cognitive process in the sense that it involves sensing the environment and responding to the environment, but not doing it in just a kind of push button stimulus response way, because even bacteria might respond to the same signal from the environment in different ways at different times because of the internal state that they have at that moment. So that's, I think, is what matters for something that we start to think of as cognitive, that it's not just a machine that does something completely automated, that it's somehow responding to its environment in a way that takes into account the dynamics of its internal state. So, I think that to me makes perhaps it feels less speculative, that actually it's a useful way of thinking about life generally, that we think of it as a sort of cognitive process.
Yeah, and you can imagine even those more simple forms of life having pretty complex machinery that is behind the actions that they end up taking without thinking that there's also some sort of associated feeling with it. But yeah, it's a fascinating discussion. I also wanted to know, did you want to say something more? I could see your...
No. That's
Okay.
That's probably as much as I can say about consciousness and sentience.
I also wanted to know if what impact your profile on Nick has since its release. Have you heard any reactions to it, or any follow-ups on the ideas that you're aware of?
Well, the ones I have heard have been, they've been positive, and I think quite a lot of people have said they were pleased to see it because they are so interested in the ideas that Nick is putting forward in his books. So that's very nice to see. I also want to stress again, and Nick is very keen to stress that not all of these ideas are ones that he has had. For one thing, he has a group of very creative students now who he said who he encourages to challenge him, and to have their own ideas, and but also Bill Martin and Mike Russell and others, John Allen at UCL, all of these people were involved in developing some of these ideas in the early days. I mean, one thing that I came across subsequently that Nick and his students, particularly a student called Stuart Harrison, have been looking into is the origin of the genetic code and whether they can say anything about that linked to metabolism. The genetic code is basically the correspondence between a sequence in DNA, a sequence of DNA bases, and the sequence of amino acids in proteins. And so it's basically, it speaks to how DNA encodes the sequence and thereby the structure the proteins take. And there is a code that it's basically there for every 3 of these DNA bases, that groups of 3 bases encode one of the 20 amino acids that appear in proteins. And this code was decoded in the 1960s. But where does it come from? And is it just arbitrary? Because, in principle, any 3 DNA bases could encode, or RNA bases ultimately could encode a given amino acid. But Nick wondered, as others have wondered, actually, is there some logic to this? Is there some reason why this particular group of 3 bases encodes this particular amino acid? And he and Stuart Harrison and others found that actually there does seem to be a relation between them. These amino acids are most of them are made as a sort of offshoot of the Krebs cycle, and he found that there's a correlation between how many steps away from the Krebs cycle the amino acids are, and which of the bases is the first one that appears in these groups of 3 bases that they're called codons that encode each amino acid. So there's some kind of pattern there. There's some kind of regularity. What does that mean? It's not quite clear. It perhaps does mean something about the fact that the bases that were most easily spun off from this cycle might have been the ones that encoded the first amino acids to be sort of recruited into the genetic code. So it may tell us something about how the genetic code itself came to be, but that's still unclear at the moment. At this stage, Nick and his colleagues have just spotted this correlation, and they're trying to, I think, to make sense of what it means.
Has his research shed any light on the plausibility of life being based on other kinds of chemicals or molecules? Like, people speculate that life could have had not a carbon-based system, but perhaps silicon, depending on the available material on whatever exoplanet it might be. Has this research affected that question at all, or?
Well, it certainly has implications for exobiology, for astrobiology, for life on a possible life on other planets. In that, what Nick has concluded from the way he's seen this Krebs cycle fall out from the very simple chemical processes that he thinks might have been involved in the origin of life, to do with how carbon dioxide and hydrogen in the early atmosphere started to react and to form these more complex organics. And what he's concluded is that if you have that process, if you have a small, a rocky planet like ours that has some kind of source of disequilibrium, like hydrothermal vents, and they're likely to be common because you just need volcanism, which most planets have. If you have that, and if you have an atmosphere that has a similar composition to the early Earth's with carbon dioxide and hydrogen in it, and again, that's very plausible. If there are planets like us, these are very common and simple molecules. That's all you need. And that, if those are the ingredients of life starting anywhere, then Nick seemed virtually ready to kind of say, then you're going to get the Krebs cycle. And if you've got the Krebs cycle, then you're going to get these amino acids and nucleic acids spun off from it. That, his view seems to be that actually a surprising amount of the basic biochemistry that is present in all life on Earth seems to be not arbitrary, but actually a sort of natural consequence of just having these very simple criteria for life, beginning on a rocky planet with water, with chemical disequilibrium, with carbon dioxide and hydrogen in the atmosphere. So, it doesn't say anything obvious, I think, about planets where you have a completely different atmosphere and you might have even a completely different basis for life. Something like Saturn's moon Titan, where the main components of the atmosphere are methane and ethane hydrocarbons, and you have lakes of liquid hydrocarbons. That's a very different chemistry, and so it's not clear that you're going to get something like a Krebs cycle there. But if you have places like even, that are similar enough to the early Earth, then he thinks it's quite likely that a lot of our chemistry will be recapitulated there. And that's a really intriguing idea at this moment when we've got the various telescopes, now the James Webb Space Telescope, looking at the atmospheres of exosolar planets. And it's already starting to give us information about the composition of those atmospheres. So, if you put all that together and we find that there are other planets like that, with that sort of composition of atmosphere, then I suspect Nick would say it's quite likely that you're going to get, at the very least, you're going to get quite similar simple organisms or proto-organisms appearing in those worlds.
What are you working on at the moment? What's next for you? Either an article or perhaps a book?
Well, I'm always working on a book, and I'm usually more than one, and it is more than one at the moment. But the main book project I'm working on at the moment is, in some ways, not sort of so far from a lot of these questions, because it's looking at it's really trying to update our story that we tell about how life works. And by that, I kind of mean, we all learn the story at school that it's, we have DNA and DNA encodes proteins. I've talked about that. And the proteins are enzymes that do all the complex chemistry. And out of that comes cells and so forth. And, the basics of that are not going to change. They're certainly right. But actually, it seemed to me that over the past 2 or 3 decades, we have found out so much more about how our genome actually, what it does and how it functions, and in particular about the incredibly complex mechanisms by which genes are regulated and the activity of genes is switched on and off. Also, so much more about how tissues are formed and how much, I would say, intelligence or cognition there is in our cells that allows them to collaborate and create tissues and complex structures. A lot of this, it seemed to me, hadn't been told. We haven't updated our narratives of biology. And a lot of these, they're actually quite complicated details. And sometimes people just throw up their hands and say, my God, life, beyond genes, life is too complicated. But what I'm trying to do in this book is to say, I'm not sure that it is. I think that we're at the point where we're starting to see other general principles above the level of genes that actually might be more important and certainly might have more causal roles in the way in building organisms like us. So that's really what this book is about. It's trying to create some new narratives that we can tell about how life, and in particular how our life, works.
That's fascinating. I can't wait for that to come out. Philip, you are one of the most illuminating and prolific science writers, at least I know of. It's been great to talk to you. Before we go, do you want to tell our viewers where they can find your work online, or if you have a Twitter they can follow?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I am on Twitter as Philip C. Ball. The C is my middle initial, so that's all one word. And I have a website, www.philipball.co.uk. So it's a very easy one. And I try to keep that updated, but as ever, it falls behind. But you can certainly find out information about all of my books there.
Great. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thanks very much.